The periscope broke the surface of the Pacific, leaving a feather-thin wake in the moonlit waters of the Caroline Islands. The Japanese submarine commander, expecting the desolate silence of a remote coral atoll, instead found his eye filled with a nightmare of industrial bioluminescence, where there should have been only palm trees and sand. A floating city blazed with the light of 1,000 arc welders. The lagoon was not empty. It was choked with battleships, carriers, and destroyers, but most terrifying of all were the massive box-like structures rising from the sea steel wombs that swallowed damaged American leviathans whole and spat them out, renewed and ready for war. Just days later, this was the Japanese Imperial Navy's fatal blind spot. They had prepared for a war of grand naval strategy, of decisive battles and samurai spirit. They had not prepared for the Advanced Base Sectional Docks, ABSDs. This is the story of the secret fleet, the floating dry docks that broke the tyranny of distance and turned the vast Pacific into an American lake. The tyranny of distance. To understand the miracle of the floating dry docks, one must first understand the geography of the Pacific theater. It is a battlefield of terrifying emptiness. From the U.S. West Coast to the Philippines is roughly 7,000 miles. From Pearl Harbor to the forward operating areas in 1944 was often 3,000 to 4,000 miles. In the early days of the war, this distance was Japan's greatest ally. If a Japanese torpedo ripped a hole in the hull of an American cruiser near Guadalcanal, that ship was essentially removed from the war for months. It had to limp back to Pearl Harbor or, worse, the naval yards of Bremerton or Mare Island in California. A single torpedo hit could dictate a strategic subtraction that lasted half a year. Japan's war doctrine relied on this attrition. They believed that by the time the American fleet returned from these long voyages of repair, the Japanese perimeter would be impregnable. They counted on the tether of logistics to strangle the American offensive. Admiral Chester Nimitz and the Bureau of Yards and Docks, however, decided to cut the tether. If the ships couldn't go to the naval base would go to the ships, the concrete and steel armada. The solution was a feat of engineering that rivaled the Manhattan Project in complexity, if not in fame. The Navy needed dry docks capable of lifting a 45,000-ton Iowa-class battleship out of the water. Yet these docks had to be mobile enough to cross an ocean. The result was the ABSD, Advanced Base Sectional Dock. These were not single vessels. They were massive, modular puzzle pieces. Because a dry dock large enough to hold a battleship was too wide to fit through the Panama Canal, American engineers designed them in sections. Each section was roughly the size of a large barge, containing its own crew quarters, power plant, and cranes. The assembly. These sections were towed individually across the Pacific at a grueling, painfully slow speed. Once they arrived at a captured lagoon like Manus or Ulithi, they were welded together. The scale. When assembled, the largest of these docks, like ABSD-1, comprised 10 sections. They created a working deck nearly 900 feet long. The function. The dock would flood its tanks, sinking deep into the lagoon. The damaged warship would float between the wing walls. Then, powerful pumps would expel the water, and the dock would rise, lifting the battleship completely out of the sea. Suddenly, a hull repair that required a dry environment could be performed 4,000 miles away from the nearest permanent shipyard. The difficult we do immediately. The impossible takes a little longer. Motto of the U.S. Navy CBEs, who often assisted in these massive construction efforts. Ulithi, the instant Pearl Harbor. The most spectacular display of this capability was at Ulithi Atoll, captured in September 1944 without a fight. Ulithi was a massive ring-shaped coral reef enclosing a deep lagoon in its natural state. It offered nothing but shelter from the waves. Within a month of American occupation, it became the third largest naval base in the world, rivaling Brooklyn and Norfolk. But unlike Brooklyn or Norfolk, Ulithi could move. Service Squadron 10, Cerveron DS, commanded by the logistical genius Commodore Worrell Reed Carter, transformed the lagoon. At the center of this floating city were the dry docks. Imagine the scene. The heat is sweltering 100 degrees in the shade with high humidity. On the ABSD, work continues 24 hours a day. By day, the sun beats down on the steel decks until they are hot enough to blister skin. By night, the lagoon is lit up by the spectral blue flash of welding torches. Japanese reconnaissance pilots, flying high overhead, reported that the Americans had somehow transported Pearl Harbor to the doorstep of the Philippines. They saw the USS South Dakota or the USS Reno enter the docks with gaping wounds from kamikaze strikes or torpedo hits. In a traditional war, those ships were kills knocked out for the duration. But at Ulithi they were patched, refitted, and rearmed in weeks, sometimes days. To the Japanese high command, it seemed as if they were fighting a hydra. Every time they damaged a ship, it returned to the battle line with impossible speed. The magic boxes in the human element, while the dry docks were triumphs of steel, they ran on flesh and blood. The sailors and artificers aboard these floating factories lived a strange, dislocated existence. They were at sea, yet they never went anywhere. They were in a war zone, yet their battles were fought against rust, bent steel, and fatigue. The crews of the dry docks became masters of improvisation. When a ship came in with its bows sheared off by a typhoon, The dry dock crews didn't just patch it, they sometimes fabricated entirely new bow sections from sheet steel on site. One famous incident involved the heavy cruiser USS Canberra and the light cruiser USS Houston, both torpedoed off Formosa. They were towed thousands of miles to the floating base at Manus. The ABSDs lifted them. Workers patched the massive holes that had flooded their engine rooms, and both ships lived to sail home. Without the forward dry docks, both likely would have been scuttled or sunk during the tow back to Pearl Harbor. The strategic checkmate. The existence of these floating dry docks fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of World War II in three distinct ways. Continuous pressure. The U.S. Navy never had to pause, because maintenance could be done forward. The operational tempo of the Pacific Fleet remained relentless. The Japanese, conversely, were forced to retreat further and further back to their home islands for repairs, ceding control of the ocean. Psychological warfare. The morale impact on Japanese commanders was devastating. There is a specific despair that comes from hitting an enemy with everything you have, only to see him standing tall the next morning. The instant Pearl Harbors robbed Japan of the belief that they could inflict lasting damage. The range extension. The dry docks allowed the U.S. Navy to bypass strongholds because the fleet carried its own base. It didn't need to capture every Japanese port to use their facilities. The U.S. could island hop, seizing an empty atoll, setting up a base, and leaving the Japanese garrisons on nearby fortified islands to wither on the vine. The invisible victory. History tends to remember the kinetic moments of war. The dive bombers at Midway. The Marines raising the flag on Iwo Jima. The thunder of the big guns at Surigao Strait. We rarely build statues to floating dry docks. However, the magic boxes of the Pacific were arguably as decisive as the aircraft carrier. They represented the triumph of American industrial capability over the rigid pre-war doctrines of the Axis powers. Japan fought a war of warriors. America fought a war of engineers. By 1945, as the U.S. fleet prepared for the invasion of Okinawa and the Japanese home islands, the ocean behind them was paved with a floating infrastructure that defied the laws of traditional naval warfare. The Japanese submarine commander, peering through his periscope at the blazing lights of Ulithi, wasn't just looking at a repair yard. He was looking at the future of warfare, a future where the front line and the supply line were fused into a single, unstoppable machine. He watched in disbelief because he was witnessing the death of the decisive battle strategy. Drowned out by the hiss of hydraulic pumps and the roar of American industry, sitting triumphantly in the middle of his ocean,